My son's wife looked me in the eye and called me old and useless. She had no idea those 3 words would cost her everything. What she didn't know is that the life she and my son live, the mortgage, the cars, the vacations, even the shopping bags piled high, was all paid for by me. One insult was all it took for me to make a single phone call and freeze the bank account she depends on. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. For 3 years, I was the silent provider behind their perfect little life. They never once asked where the money came from, and I never told them. I thought I was being a good father, generous enough to make sure my family had every chance at happiness. But when Sarah, my daughter-in-law, decided to humiliate me, I realized I hadn't raised gratitude. I had raised entitlement, and that's when I decided to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. I built my construction company from the ground up, starting with nothing but a hammer and a battered pickup truck at 22. 50 years of sweat, of 5 a.m. alarms, of coming home caked in sawdust and concrete, of missed birthdays and empty chairs at school plays, all so my family could have more than I ever did. When my wife Margaret died of cancer 15 years ago, I buried my grief in my work, driven by the dream of leaving David a legacy he could be proud of. 5 years ago, I sold the company for more money than I ever dreamed of. I thought it was time to rest and watch my son carve his own path. Instead, I became the invisible wallet for 2 people who mistook love for weakness and generosity for foolishness. My son David has always been the center of my world, especially after his mother, my beloved wife Margaret, passed away from cancer when he was just 16. I raised that boy on my own, working 16-hour days running my construction business to make sure he never wanted for anything. I paid for his college education, his first car, helped him get his first job, and when he met Sarah 5 years ago, I was thrilled that he'd found someone who seemed to make him happy. Sarah was beautiful, charming when she wanted to be, and she had this way of making David laugh that reminded me of how his mother used to light up his face. When they announced their engagement, I didn't hesitate to offer to pay for their wedding. $28,000 for what Sarah called the wedding of her dreams, complete with a destination ceremony in Napa Valley, designer flowers, and a reception for 150 guests. David tried to protest, saying they could do something smaller, but Sarah's eyes lit up at the mention of money, and I could see how much it meant to her. I thought I was investing in their happiness, in their future together. I even helped them find their house, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in the best neighborhood in town. And when David's credit score wasn't quite high enough to qualify for the mortgage they wanted, I co-signed without a second thought. I also contributed $40,000 for their down payment, money I'd been saving for my own retirement. But seeing them happy, seeing them settled, felt worth more than any vacation or comfortable retirement I could have had. Margaret would have loved seeing David so settled and content, would have been thrilled to have a daughter-in-law to spoil and grandchildren to dote on. I used to imagine holiday dinners with a full table again, birthday parties for grandkids, maybe even teaching a grandson or granddaughter how to use tools the way I'd taught David. Sarah seemed perfect for our family, always remembering to send me birthday cards and Christmas gifts, always including me in their plans, and asking for my advice on everything from career decisions to home improvements. I thought I'd gained not just a daughter-in-law, but a daughter, someone who would be there to take care of David the way Margaret had taken care of both of us. Looking back now, I realize that Sarah's attention and affection were always directly proportional to how much money I was willing to spend. When I was picking up dinner tabs and paying for vacation expenses, she was sweet and grateful and made sure to tell David how lucky he was to have such a generous father. But the moment I might hesitate or suggest they handle an expense themselves, her demeanor would cool noticeably, and suddenly I'd find myself excluded from family plans until the next time they needed financial help. Everything seemed perfect for the first 2 years of their marriage. David was working as an IT consultant, making decent money, and Sarah had a job at a marketing firm. They seemed independent, successful, and happy. Then, the recession hit our area harder than expected, and David's company started laying people off. When he lost his job 2 years ago, I watched my son fall apart. He'd always been proud, always tried to handle his own problems, just like I taught him. But watching him struggle to find work, watching him send out hundreds of resumes and get rejection after rejection, broke my heart. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I called my bank and set up automatic transfers to their joint account, $4,000 every month, deposited quietly without fanfare or discussion. When David asked how they were managing to keep up with all their bills, I just told him I'd helped out a little bit. I never specified how much or for how long. I figured he'd find another job soon and we'd never need to talk about it. But months turned into a year, and David was still struggling to find something that paid even half of what he used to make. The job market was brutal, especially for someone in his field who'd been out of work for so long. I watched my son's confidence crumble, watched him blame himself for their financial struggles, never knowing that I was quietly covering everything behind the scenes. I told myself I was protecting his pride while also protecting their future. I never imagined that my generosity would be seen as weakness, or that the woman my son married would view my help as her entitlement. During this time, I started spending more time at their house, ostensibly to provide emotional support, but really because I wanted to make sure they were doing okay. I'd bring groceries, claiming I'd bought too much for one person, or I'd offer to fix things around their house that didn't really need fixing. Sarah always seemed grateful for these visits, always made a point of thanking me and telling David how wonderful it was to have family who cared so much. I started to feel needed again in a way I hadn't since Margaret died. Taking care of David and Sarah gave me a sense of purpose, made me feel like the protector and provider I'd always been. What I didn't understand was that I was creating a dependency that would ultimately corrupt the very relationships I was trying to preserve. By making myself indispensable financially, I was inadvertently teaching them to see me as a resource rather than a person, a problem solver rather than a father and father-in-law who deserved basic respect and gratitude. Just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, Sarah decided to quit her job. This was about 8 months after David lost his, when their finances should have been at their most precarious. But because I was secretly covering all their major expenses, Sarah apparently felt comfortable enough to walk away from her steady paycheck. She told David and me that she needed to focus on finding herself and exploring her creative passions. She'd always talked about wanting to be an artist or maybe start her own business, and I suppose with someone else paying all the bills, it seemed like the perfect time to pursue those dreams. David was obviously concerned about losing their second income, but Sarah was persuasive. She convinced him that this was temporary, that she'd find something even better, and that they could manage on whatever part-time work he could find. What David didn't know was that managing meant I had to increase my monthly transfers from $4,000 to $5,500. Their mortgage alone was $2,800 a month. Then there were 2 car payments, insurance, utilities, groceries, and Sarah's new hobby of online shopping. I justified it to myself by thinking that Sarah deserved a chance to figure out what she wanted to do with her life, and that supporting her was another way of supporting my son. I remembered how hard it had been for Margaret and me when we were young and struggling, and I didn't want David and Sarah to go through that same stress. But as months went by and Sarah showed no signs of actually looking for work or starting any kind of business, I began to realize that finding herself had become a full-time job that consisted mainly of spa days, lunch dates with friends, and shopping trips that I was unknowingly funding. Sarah's daily routine became a source of increasing concern for me, though I tried to hide my feelings. She would sleep until 10 or 11 in the morning, then spend an hour getting ready before heading out for what she called networking meetings or creative inspiration sessions. These usually involved expensive coffee dates with other unemployed women in similar situations. followed by shopping trips to boutique stores where she'd buy clothes and accessories that cost more than many people made in a week. When I'd visit in the afternoons, I'd often find her on the couch watching reality television or browsing social media, surrounded by shopping bags and takeout containers from expensive restaurants. When I'd ask about her business plans or job search, she'd give vague answers about developing her brand or waiting for the right opportunity. Meanwhile, David was desperately applying for any job he could find, taking temporary work that paid a fraction of his previous salary and beating himself up for not being able to provide for his wife the way he thought he should. The irony was heartbreaking. My son was working himself to exhaustion trying to support a lifestyle that I was actually funding, while his wife was living like a trust fund baby without ever acknowledging where the money was coming from. The wake-up call should have been my heart episode last month. I'd been feeling chest pains for a few days, but kept pushing through them, telling myself it was just stress or indigestion. When I finally collapsed in my kitchen and had to call an ambulance, the doctors told me I'd had what they called a cardiac event. Not quite a full heart attack, but serious enough to require 2 days in the hospital for observation and testing. I was scared, more scared than I'd been since Margaret's diagnosis. Lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines and monitors, all I could think about was how much I wanted to see my son. David did come to visit, but only once, and he stayed for maybe 20 minutes before saying he had to get home to Sarah. I understood that hospitals can be uncomfortable places, and I didn't want to be a burden, but those 2 days felt like the longest of my life. Sarah never came at all. She never called, never sent flowers, never even asked David how I was doing beyond a quick, "Is he okay?" text message. But what really opened my eyes was what happened when I got home from the hospital. I found a text message from Sarah on my phone, sent while I was still in the cardiac care unit, asking if I could help them cover a vacation to Hawaii that she'd been planning. "David really needs a break from all the stress," she wrote, "and I found this amazing deal on a resort package, but we're a little short this month." A little short. While I was lying in a hospital bed, wondering if I was having a heart attack, she was planning a vacation and asking me to pay for it. I stared at that text for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. For the first time, I started to question whether my generosity was really helping my family or just enabling them to treat me like a convenient resource. The hospital experience had forced me to confront my own mortality in a way I'd been avoiding since Margaret's death. I realized that I'd been so focused on taking care of David and Sarah that I'd completely neglected my own health and well-being. I'd been skipping my own doctor's appointments because I was too busy solving their problems, ignoring warning signs from my body because I was too worried about their financial stress. The chest pains I'd been experiencing weren't just physical symptoms. They were my body's way of telling me that the emotional stress of secretly supporting 2 ungrateful people was literally killing me. As I lay in that hospital bed, I started to think about what Margaret would say if she could see what I'd become. She'd always been the practical one in our relationship, the one who could spot a manipulative person from a mile away and wasn't afraid to call them out. She would have been furious about Sarah's text message, would have marched into that hospital room and given me a piece of her mind about enabling such selfish behavior. More than that, she would have been heartbroken to see me sacrificing my health and dignity for people who couldn't even be bothered to visit me when I was sick. I've always been a hands-on kind of man, someone who believes in fixing things myself rather than calling expensive repair services. It's a habit from my construction days when knowing how to handle tools and solve problems was part of earning a living. So when David called me last week and mentioned that their kitchen faucet had broken and they were getting quotes from plumbers that seemed outrageous, I naturally offered to come over and take a look. I figured it was probably something simple, maybe a worn washer or a loose connection, the kind of thing I could fix in an hour with parts that cost less than $20. David seemed grateful for the offer, and Sarah didn't object, probably because she knew it would save them money they didn't actually have. I arrived at their house on a Saturday morning with my toolbox, ready to tackle what I assumed would be a straightforward repair job. The faucet was indeed a mess, leaking from multiple points and barely producing water pressure, clearly something that had been neglected for too long. I got down under the sink to examine the pipes and connections, trying to figure out the best approach for the repair. That's when I heard Sarah talking on the phone in the living room, just around the corner from the kitchen. At first, I wasn't really listening, just focusing on my work and trying to identify which parts I'd need to buy. But then I heard my name mentioned, and something in Sarah's tone made me stop what I was doing and pay attention. She was talking to her sister, I realized, having one of their regular weekend catch-up conversations. I should have made some noise, should have let her know I was there and could hear everything she was saying. But something held me back. Some instinct that told me I needed to hear this conversation. The kitchen and living room were separated by just a thin wall, and the house was quiet except for Sarah's voice and the occasional sound of my tools. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear every word, even though part of me suspected that what I was about to learn would change everything between us. In that moment, crouched under their sink with my hands covered in grime and rust, I was about to discover the truth about how my daughter-in-law really saw me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally underneath them, in the most humble and service-oriented position possible, when I would overhear exactly how little respect that service had earned me. Years of construction work had given me good hearing, and the acoustics of their house meant that every word Sarah spoke was crystal clear. I could hear her moving around the living room, probably pacing the way she always did when she was on the phone, gesturing and laughing as she talked. What I couldn't have prepared myself for was the casual cruelty that was about to pour out of her mouth, or how completely it would shatter my understanding of our family dynamic. What I heard in the next few minutes changed everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. "Oh, the old fool is here fixing our sink," Sarah was saying, and I could hear the eye roll in her voice even though I couldn't see her face. "He's so old and useless now, can barely see what he's doing, but at least he's good for paying our bills. I swear, Jenny, it's like having a senile ATM machine. David's too much of a coward to ask Daddy for money directly, so I have to manage the old man myself." She paused, obviously listening to her sister's response, then laughed in a way that made my blood run cold. "Are you kidding? He has no idea how much we're actually getting from him. I've got David convinced that his dad is just helping out a little bit here and there, but the reality is the old guy has been covering our entire lifestyle for years. The mortgage, the cars, everything. We haven't paid for anything real since David lost his job, and I haven't worked in almost 2 years. It's amazing what you can get away with when someone's desperate to feel needed." My hands started shaking as I crouched there under the sink, tools scattered around me, listening to this woman tear apart every assumption I'd had about our family dynamic. "The best part," she continued, "is that he thinks he's being so generous and helpful, like some kind of family saint. But really, he's just lonely and scared of being abandoned, so he throws money at us to keep us coming around. It's actually kind of pathetic when you think about it, a successful businessman reduced to buying his son's attention." I had to grip the edge of the sink cabinet to steady myself, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. But Sarah wasn't finished. "Jenny, you should see how he lights up when we invite him over for dinner or ask his advice about something. It's like watching a puppy who's desperate for approval. He's so grateful for any scrap of attention that he'll pay whatever it costs to keep getting it. David thinks his dad is just being generous, but I know better. The old man is buying our love because he's terrified of being alone. And as long as he keeps paying, I'm happy to let him think we actually enjoy having him around." The words hit me like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. This wasn't just ingratitude or casual disrespect. This was calculated manipulation, a deliberate exploitation of my love for my son and my grief over losing my wife. Sarah had seen right through to my deepest fears and vulnerabilities, and she was using them to extract money from me while laughing about it with her sister. The woman I'd welcomed into my family, the woman I'd paid to give the wedding of her dreams, the woman I'd been supporting for years, saw me as nothing more than a lonely old fool who could be manipulated through his own generosity. I don't remember how I finished fixing that faucet. Somehow my hands kept working, even though my mind was reeling from what I'd just heard. When I finally crawled out from under the sink, Sarah was off the phone and back to her normal sweet act, thanking me for helping them out and offering me a cup of coffee like she was the perfect daughter-in-law. I managed to mumble something about needing to get home and packed up my tools as quickly as possible, desperate to get out of that house before I said something I couldn't take back. David wasn't even there. He'd gone to some job interview that probably wouldn't lead anywhere, leaving Sarah alone to reveal her true feelings about the man who'd been supporting their entire lifestyle. The drive home felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept hearing her words echoing in my head. Old and useless, senile ATM machine, pathetic. 50 years of building a successful construction business from nothing. Raising a son on my own after losing my wife, working myself to the bone to provide for my family, and this is how I was seen by the woman my son married. Not as a generous father or a loving grandfather-to-be, but as a convenient source of money that she had to manage to keep the cash flowing. When I got home to my empty house, I sat in my recliner and felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret died. Complete and utter loneliness. But it wasn't just loneliness, it was the crushing realization that the family I thought I was supporting didn't actually exist. The grateful son and loving daughter-in-law I'd been helping were just characters in a story I'd been telling myself while they laughed at my expense behind my back. I thought about all the times I'd worried about being a burden to them, all the times I'd hesitated to call or visit because I didn't want to impose on their busy lives. Meanwhile, they were living entirely off my money and discussing my emotional neediness like it was a strategy to be exploited. I remembered every family dinner I'd paid for, every vacation I'd funded, every crisis I'd solved with my checkbook, and I realized that none of it had been about love or gratitude or family bonds. It had all been about money, about a lonely old man who could be counted on to open his wallet whenever they needed something. The house felt hollow around me, filled with memories of Margaret and David's childhood, but empty of the family connection I'd been trying so desperately to maintain. I looked around at the home we'd built together, at the photographs of happier times, at the life I'd worked so hard to create, and I wondered how I'd become such a fool. Margaret would have seen through Sarah's manipulation immediately, would have protected me from making the mistakes that had led me to this moment of devastating clarity. But Margaret was gone, and I'd been so afraid of losing David too that I'd let myself become a victim of my own generosity. That night was one of the longest of my life. I couldn't eat, couldn't watch television, couldn't focus on anything except the conversation I'd overheard. I kept replaying every interaction I'd had with David and Sarah over the past few years, looking for signs I'd missed, clues that should have told me what was really happening. How many times had Sarah's gratitude seemed forced or perfunctory? How often had David avoided talking about their finances in any detail? How many family dinners had I paid for while they exchanged glances across the table, probably amazed that the old fool hadn't figured out their game? I thought about all the times I'd worried about being a burden to them, all the times I'd stayed home instead of calling to visit because I didn't want to impose. Meanwhile, they were living entirely off my money and seeing me as nothing more than a resource to be manipulated. The worst part was thinking about David, my own son, sitting quietly while his wife called his father pathetic and useless. Even if he didn't know the extent of Sarah's manipulation, he had to know that I'd been helping them financially. He had to have some idea that their bills were being paid by someone other than their non-existent income, But instead of having an honest conversation with me about it, he'd chosen to let Sarah handle the old man while he pretended ignorance. I'd raised him to be better than that, to be honest and direct and respectful. Where had I gone wrong? How had my generous, loving son turned into someone who would let his wife mock his father while living off that same father's hard-earned money? By morning, I realized that my hurt and disappointment had crystallized into something much more focused: determination. They wanted to treat me like a foolish old man? Fine. But this foolish old man still controlled every dollar they were spending, and it was time they learned exactly what that meant. I spent the early hours of that sleepless night thinking about Margaret, about what she would have done in this situation. She'd always been the practical one in our relationship, the one who could make tough decisions when I was too soft-hearted or too generous for my own good. She would have been furious about Sarah's disrespect and David's cowardice, but she also would have wanted me to handle it in a way that preserved the possibility of redemption. Margaret believed in consequences, but she also believed in forgiveness for those who truly earned it. As the sun came up, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could continue being the senile ATM machine that Sarah found so amusing, keep funding their lifestyle while they laughed at me behind my back, and hope that somehow things would improve on their own. Or I could take control of the situation, use the financial power I'd never realized I possessed, and force them to confront the reality of their choices. The decision, when it finally came, felt inevitable. I was done being manipulated, done being disrespected, done enabling two people who saw my love as weakness and my generosity as stupidity. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Margaret Wilson, who'd been handling my business affairs for over 20 years. Margaret was sharp as a tack, despite being nearly as old as I was, and she'd helped me navigate everything from business contracts to estate planning. If anyone could help me understand exactly what power I had in this situation, it would be her. "Robert," she said when I explained why I was calling, "I need you to bring me every document related to your financial arrangements with David and Sarah. Bank statements, loan documents, anything showing money changing hands, and I need you to tell me exactly what's been going on." Her tone was professional but concerned, like she could sense that this wasn't just a routine legal question. I spent the rest of that morning gathering paperwork, copies of the mortgage documents where I'd co-signed, records of all the automatic transfers I'd been making to their account, receipts from the wedding expenses I'd paid, documentation of the down payment I'd provided. Looking at it all spread out on my kitchen table, I was amazed at how much money I'd actually given them over the years. It wasn't just the monthly payments. It was tens of thousands of dollars in one-time expenses, gifts, and bailouts that I'd never really added up before. When I met with Margaret that afternoon, she spent nearly an hour going through everything, asking detailed questions about each transaction and arrangement. Her expression grew more serious as she reviewed the documents, occasionally making notes or asking me to clarify the timeline of certain payments. Finally, she looked up at me with the kind of expression I'd learned to recognize from years of business dealings. She had news, and it wasn't what I expected. "Robert," she said, setting aside her reading glasses and leaning back in her chair, "before I explain your legal position here, I want you to understand that what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse. Not the criminal kind, necessarily, but a clear pattern of emotional manipulation designed to extract money from you while giving you nothing but disrespect in return." The term elder abuse made me wince, but Margaret continued without apology. "The good news, if you can call it that, is that you're in a much stronger position than you probably realize. Every transaction you've made has been properly documented. Every arrangement is legally sound, and most importantly, you've retained control over the financial instruments that matter." She began organizing the documents into different piles, explaining as she went. What David and Sarah probably don't understand is that generosity doesn't equal obligation, and accepting help doesn't grant permanent entitlement to that help. You've been supporting them voluntarily, which means you can stop supporting them just as voluntarily. Margaret's assessment of my situation was both reassuring and sobering, and as she continued to explain the legal realities of my financial relationships with David and Sarah, I began to understand that I had far more power than I'd ever imagined. "Robert," Margaret said, setting down her pen and looking at me directly, "you need to understand something important about your financial relationship with David and Sarah. Legally speaking, you have far more control here than you probably realize." She spread out several documents on her desk, pointing to specific clauses and signatures as she explained my situation. First, the house. Yes, it's in David and Sarah's names, but you're not just a co-signer on that mortgage, you're listed as the primary responsible party. The bank considers you the main borrower, with David as a secondary. That means you have the right to call in that loan at any time, which would force either immediate payment in full or a sale of the property. I felt my eyes widen as she continued. Second, and this is the big one, that joint account you've been transferring money into, it's not actually their account with you as a contributor. When you set it up, you established it as a subsidiary account under your primary banking relationship. You're the primary account holder, and they're essentially authorized users. Every dollar in that account is legally yours, and you can freeze their access or close the account entirely whenever you choose. Margaret pulled out another document, one I'd apparently signed years ago but forgotten about. You also have power of attorney over several of their financial arrangements, things you agreed to when you co-signed various loans and credit applications. Robert, the bottom line is this. They're not just dependent on your generosity, they're completely subject to your financial control. If you wanted to, you could cut off their access to funds immediately, call in the mortgage, and essentially force them to restructure their entire financial life. The implications of what she was telling me began to sink in. All this time, I'd felt like the powerless one in this relationship, the aging father begging for scraps of attention from his ungrateful family. But the reality was exactly the opposite. Every major financial decision in their lives, from their mortgage to their daily expenses, was tied to my credit, my accounts, and my approval. "Why didn't I realize this before?" I asked, feeling somewhat foolish. Margaret smiled sympathetically. "Because you were being a loving father and grandfather-to-be, not a banker. You set these arrangements up to help your family, not to control them. The control was always there, you just chose not to exercise it." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Robert, I have to ask you this directly. What do you want to accomplish here? Are you looking to punish them for their disrespect, or are you trying to save your relationship with your son?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with since overhearing Sarah's phone conversation. "I want them to understand that respect isn't optional," I said finally. "I want David to take responsibility for his own life, and I want Sarah to learn that my money comes with conditions, even if those conditions are as basic as treating me like a human being instead of an ATM machine." Margaret wasn't finished explaining the extent of my financial control over David and Sarah's situation. "There's more," she said, pulling out a thick folder I hadn't seen before. "Over the years, you've essentially become the silent partner in their entire lifestyle. The car loans, the credit cards, even some of their insurance policies list you as a guarantor or emergency contact with financial responsibility. If you chose to exercise your rights, you could force them to account for every penny they've spent of your money." She showed me documents I'd signed over the years, each one giving me more legal authority than I'd realized at the time. "The beauty of your position, from a legal standpoint, is that everything has been above board. You haven't been secretly funneling money or hiding assets. You've been legitimately supporting them through proper financial channels, which means you have every right to stop that support or demand accountability for how your money has been used." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my reaction. "Robert, I've been practicing law for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of family financial situations. What you're describing, Sarah's attitude, David's passive acceptance of your support, without acknowledgement, this is financial elder abuse, even if it's not criminal. They're manipulating your love for your son to extract money from you while showing you no respect or gratitude." The term elder abuse hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought of myself as a victim, never considered that what was happening to me had a name and legal implications. "What are my options?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Margaret smiled grimly. "Oh, you have options. The question is how far you want to take this, and whether your goal is to teach them a lesson or to protect yourself from further exploitation." She began outlining various scenarios, each one more dramatic than the last, but all of them perfectly legal and within my rights as the person who'd been funding their lifestyle. "You could start small," she explained, "just freeze their account access for a few days to get their attention. Or you could go nuclear, call in all the loans, force the sale of the house, and leave them to figure out how to survive on their actual income." Margaret pulled out a legal pad and began sketching out different approaches. "There's also a middle ground. You could restructure everything as formal loans with payment schedules and interest, essentially converting your gifts into business arrangements that they'd have to take seriously." The idea of treating my family relationships like business transactions felt wrong, but then again, Sarah had already turned our family dynamic into a business transaction. She just hadn't been honest about it. "What would you recommend?" I asked. Margaret looked at me thoughtfully. "As your lawyer, I'd recommend protecting your assets and establishing clear boundaries. As someone who's watched families destroy themselves over money for 4 decades, I'd recommend giving David one chance to prove he's the man you raised him to be. But Sarah," she shook her head, "Sarah has shown you who she is. Believe her." I left Margaret's office with more information than I'd expected, and a decision to make that would affect the rest of my relationship with my son. I could continue letting them take advantage of me, pretending I didn't know what Sarah really thought of me and hoping that somehow things would improve. Or I could exercise the financial control I'd never realized I possessed and force them to confront the reality of their situation. That weekend, I sat in my house, Margaret's house, the house where David had grown up, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and graduations, and I tried to figure out what kind of man I wanted to be in the final chapters of my life. I thought about what Margaret would have done in this situation. She'd always been the one who kept me grounded, who wasn't afraid to tell me when I was being too soft or too generous for my own good. I could almost hear her voice telling me that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's just enabling. She would have been furious about Sarah's disrespect and David's cowardice, and she wouldn't have tolerated it for a moment, but she also would have wanted me to handle it in a way that left room for redemption, for David to step up and become the man she'd raised him to be. I decided that I would give them one final chance to acknowledge what I'd done for them, to show some genuine gratitude and respect for the sacrifices I'd made. If they could do that, if they could have an honest conversation about our financial arrangement and commit to treating me like a human being rather than an ATM machine, then maybe we could work something out that preserved our family relationships while establishing better boundaries. But if they couldn't, if Sarah continued to see me as a senile old fool, and David continued to hide behind her manipulation, then I would show them exactly what financial independence looked like when the person funding their lifestyle decided he'd had enough. The plan I developed over that weekend was simple in concept, but devastating in its potential impact. I would invite them for dinner, create an opportunity for honest conversation about our financial arrangement, and see how they responded to the truth. If they showed genuine remorse and respect, I'd work with Margaret to restructure our arrangement with clear boundaries and expectations. If they didn't, I'd use every legal tool at my disposal to cut them off completely and let them face the consequences of their choices. As I sat in Margaret's favorite chair that Sunday evening, looking at the photographs of our life together and the home we'd built, I realized that this wasn't just about money or respect or family dynamics. It was about who I wanted to be for whatever years I had left. Did I want to be the pathetic old man that Sarah described to her sister, desperately buying affection from people who saw me as nothing more than a source of funds? Or did I want to be the strong, principled man that Margaret had fallen in love with, someone who stood up for himself and demanded the respect he'd earned through decades of hard work and sacrifice? The answer, when I finally allowed myself to acknowledge it, was clear. I'd spent too many years being afraid of losing David to set appropriate boundaries, and that fear had turned me into exactly the kind of person Sarah could manipulate without consequence. It was time to remember who I really was, a man who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd raised a good son under impossible circumstances, and who deserved better than to be treated like a convenient fool by people who wouldn't exist without his generosity. I spent Monday morning rehearsing what I was going to say. I wanted to give David and Sarah a fair opportunity to come clean about our financial arrangement and to show some acknowledgement of what I'd been doing for them. So I called David and invited them both over for dinner that evening, telling him I had something important to discuss about my estate planning. I figured that would get both of their attention, especially Sarah's. Sure enough, David said they'd be there, and I could hear Sarah in the background asking what kind of estate planning I wanted to discuss. The irony wasn't lost on me that the mention of inheritance money would bring them running faster than my heart episode had. I spent the afternoon cooking Margaret's famous pot roast recipe, setting the table with the good china, and preparing what I hoped would be either a reconciliation dinner or a last meal before I changed their lives forever. When they arrived, Sarah was dressed up like she was going to a business meeting, and she kept glancing around the house like she was taking inventory. David seemed nervous, probably sensing that something significant was about to happen but not sure what. During dinner, I kept the conversation light, asking about David's job search and Sarah's various projects. Sarah was more animated than usual, talking about some online business idea she claimed to be developing, though her descriptions were vague enough that I suspected it existed mainly in her imagination. David mostly listened, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When we'd finished eating and I'd served coffee and Margaret's apple pie, I took a deep breath and began the conversation I'd been planning all day. "I want to talk to both of you about something that's been on my mind lately," I said, trying to keep my tone casual and non-confrontational. "I've been thinking about my finances, about how I want to handle things as I get older, and I realized we should probably have an honest discussion about how I've been helping you both over the past few years." The shift in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Sarah straightened in her chair, her fork halfway to her mouth with a bite of pie, suddenly alert like a cat that had heard a mouse in the walls. David looked confused and slightly panicked, the way he used to look as a child when he thought he might be in trouble for something he couldn't remember doing. I could see them exchanging glances across the table, some kind of silent communication that made me realize they'd discussed this possibility before, probably wondering when and if I'd ever bring up the topic of money directly. The dining room felt smaller suddenly, the walls seeming to close in around us as we prepared to have the conversation that none of us had been brave enough or honest enough to initiate before now. I looked at my son and daughter-in-law, these two people I'd been supporting for years without acknowledgement, and wondered if the next few minutes would save our family or destroy it completely. The reaction to my opening statement was immediate and telling. David looked genuinely surprised, like he'd never expected this conversation to happen, while Sarah's expression shifted to something more calculating, like she was trying to figure out where I was going with this. "Dad," David started, "you know we're grateful for everything you've done to help us out. Things have been tough since I lost my job, but I'm working hard to get back on my feet." I nodded encouragingly. "I know you are, son, and I want you to know that I've been happy to help. But I think it's important that we're all clear about exactly what that help has looked like." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared with bank statements and transfer records. "Over the past 3 years, I've transferred over $200,000 to your account. I've been covering your mortgage, your car payments, your utilities, your groceries, essentially all of your living expenses." David's face went white. "Dad, I had no idea it was that much. I thought you were just helping us out with a few $100s here and there." But Sarah's reaction was completely different. She shrugged, as if I'd just told her the weather forecast. "Well," she said, reaching for another piece of pie, "what else are you going to do with your money? You can't take it with you, and it's not like you have any other family to spend it on. Besides, isn't that what parents are supposed to do? Help their children succeed?" I stared at her, amazed by her casual entitlement. This was her chance to show some gratitude, some recognition of the sacrifice I'd made, and instead she was acting like I owed her my financial support. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You think I'm obligated to fund your lifestyle?" She laughed, actually laughed. "Robert, let's be realistic here. David is your only child, which means we're your only family. You've got more money than you could ever spend, and we're young people trying to build a life together. It just makes sense for you to invest in our future." That word, invest, combined with her dismissive tone, told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to end. David was looking back and forth between us, clearly uncomfortable with Sarah's bluntness, but not brave enough to contradict her. I could see the wheels turning in his head, probably trying to figure out how to smooth things over and keep everyone happy, the same conflict avoidance that had gotten us into this situation in the first place. "And what exactly am I investing in?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "Sarah, you haven't worked in almost 2 years. You've turned down every job opportunity that's come your way because they weren't creative enough, or didn't pay enough, or required too much commitment. What future are we building here?" Her smile faltered slightly, but her entitled attitude remained intact. "I'm developing my brand, Robert. I'm building something that will be worth much more than any regular job. These things take time, and they require investment." "My investment," I corrected. "Your dreams, my money." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I watched Sarah's expression harden as she realized that this conversation wasn't going the way she'd expected. I excused myself from the dinner table, telling David and Sarah that I needed to get something from my study. What I actually needed was a moment to compose myself and to make a phone call that would change everything. I sat down at my desk, took out my cell phone, and called the after-hours customer service line for my bank. "I need to freeze account access for all authorized users on account number." I gave them the details for the subsidiary account that had been funding David and Sarah's lifestyle for 3 years. "I'm the primary account holder, and I want to immediately suspend all debit card access, online banking privileges, and automatic payments from this account." The customer service representative confirmed that she could process this request immediately, and within minutes, David and Sarah had no access to the money they'd been spending so casually. I also called the automatic transfer service and canceled the monthly deposits that had been going to their account. Then I sat there for a few minutes, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: complete control over my own financial life. When I returned to the dining room, David and Sarah were whispering urgently to each other, but they stopped when I sat down. "I've been thinking about what you said, Sarah," I began, "about how I should invest in your future and how it just makes sense for me to support you both. And you're absolutely right about one thing. It is my money, and I do get to decide how to spend it." Sarah smiled, probably thinking she'd won some kind of victory. "The thing is," I continued, I've decided that the best investment I can make in your future is to help you learn how to be financially independent. So as of right now, I'm discontinuing all financial support. The monthly transfers will stop. The account access is frozen, and you're going to have the opportunity to figure out how to pay your own bills." The silence that followed was deafening. David looked confused and panicked, while Sarah's face went through several expressions before settling on fury. "You can't do this to us," she said, her voice rising. "We have bills due, commitments to pay. You can't just cut us off without warning." I looked at her calmly, feeling more in control than I had in years. "Sarah, I just gave you 3 years of warning. 3 years of paying your bills while you treated me like a convenient ATM machine. 3 years of funding a lifestyle you never earned and never showed gratitude for. Consider this your notice that the Bank of Robert is officially closed." David finally found his voice. "Dad, please, can we talk about this? I know we should have been more appreciative, more aware of how much you were doing for us. But cutting us off completely, we'll lose everything." "No, David," I corrected him. "You'll lose everything I was paying for. You'll have exactly what you've earned through your own work and Sarah's contributions, which, as far as I can tell, amounts to whatever part-time income you've been able to find." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You're being petty and vindictive over nothing. So what if I said some things to my sister that hurt your feelings? That doesn't give you the right to destroy our lives." "Actually," I said, standing up to face her, "it gives me every right. It's my money, my choice, and my decision to stop enabling two people who see my generosity as weakness and my love as something to be exploited." The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7 a.m. It was Sarah, and she was absolutely hysterical. "You've ruined everything," she screamed before I could even say hello. "Do you know what you've done? Our mortgage payment bounced. Our credit cards are being declined. The car loan payment didn't go through." I held the phone away from my ear as she continued her tirade, listing every financial obligation that had suddenly become their problem instead of mine. "Sarah," I said when she finally paused for breath, "I told you last night exactly what I was going to do. None of this should be a surprise to you." "But you can't actually do this," she insisted. "We'll lose everything, the house, the cars, our credit rating. You're destroying your son's life because your feelings got hurt." I almost laughed at that characterization. "My feelings got hurt? Sarah, for 3 years I've been paying for your entire lifestyle while you called me old and useless behind my back. This isn't about hurt feelings, it's about self-respect." There was a pause, and I could hear her talking to someone else, probably David. Then she came back on the line with a different approach. "Look, Robert, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I know I can come across as direct sometimes, but you have to understand that we never meant any disrespect. We're family, and family helps each other out, right?" The fake sweetness in her voice was almost more insulting than her earlier screaming. "Here's what's going to happen," I said calmly. "You and David are going to learn how to live within your actual means. David is going to take whatever job he can find, even if it's not perfect, and you're going to get a job too. Any job. You're going to figure out how to pay your own bills, like adults." "And what if we can't?" she asked, her voice turning cold again. "What if we lose the house?" "Then you'll find somewhere else to live that you can actually afford," I replied, "just like millions of other people do every day." The phone went quiet for a moment, then Sarah's voice came back, lower and more threatening than I'd ever heard it. "You're going to regret this, old man. You're going to die alone and forgotten, and it'll be your own fault." I was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle between us. This was the real Sarah, the one I'd overheard talking to her sister, the one who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited until I was no longer useful. "Sarah," I said finally, I'd rather die alone with my dignity intact than live surrounded by people who only pretend to love me for my money. At least now I know where we stand." I hung up the phone and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time since Margaret died, I wasn't afraid of being alone, because I realized that I'd been alone all along. The family dinners, the holiday celebrations, the phone calls and visits, all of it had been purchased with my checkbook, not earned through genuine affection or respect. Sarah's threat to leave me alone and forgotten actually sounded like a relief, because it meant I wouldn't have to keep pretending that their attention was real or that their gratitude was sincere. About an hour after Sarah's threatening phone call, David called me. He was crying, which broke my heart because I hadn't heard my son cry since his mother's funeral. "Dad, please," he said through his tears, "I know Sarah said some things that were out of line, but you can't do this to us. We'll lose everything we've worked for." I wanted to ask him what exactly he'd worked for, since I'd been paying for all of it, but I could hear the genuine desperation in his voice. "David," I said gently, "what exactly did you know about our financial arrangement? How much did you think I was helping you?" There was a long pause. I thought you were just helping us out with a few bills here and there, maybe $500 or $600 a month. I never asked for specifics because I was embarrassed that we needed help at all." This was what I'd hoped to hear, that my son had been ignorant of the extent of Sarah's manipulation, not complicit in it. "Son, I've been transferring $5,500 a month to your account for almost 2 years. Before that, it was $4,000 a month, plus your mortgage down payment, your wedding, your car repairs, your vacations, over $200,000 in 3 years. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long, I thought the call had been disconnected. "Dad," he finally whispered, "I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea it was that much. Sarah always handled our finances, said she was better with money than I was. She told me you were just helping out a little bit, and that we were mostly managing on our own." I felt a flicker of hope that maybe my relationship with David could be salvaged. "I believe you, son, but here's what I need from you now. I need you to take responsibility for your own life. Get whatever job you can find, even if it's not in your field. Stop letting Sarah make all your financial decisions. And most importantly, I need you to understand that respect isn't optional in our family." "I'll do anything," he promised. "I'll get a job this week. I'll figure out how to pay our bills. I'll make this right." His voice was shaking, but there was something in it that reminded me of the boy I'd raised, the one who used to help me with construction projects and always wanted to prove that he could handle whatever task I gave him. "But Dad," he continued, "please don't cut us off completely. I know we don't deserve your help after what Sarah said, after how we've taken you for granted, but if we lose the house—" His voice broke again, and I could hear the weight of his fear and shame. "David, I'm going to tell you something that your mother told me once when I was struggling with a difficult decision about the business. She said that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them fail, because failure teaches lessons that success never can. You and Sarah have been living in a fantasy world where money appears without effort and lifestyle has no connection to income. That fantasy is over." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, processing what I was telling him. "I know it seems harsh," I continued, "but I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it because I love you too much to watch you turn into the kind of man who lets his wife manipulate his father while he pretends not to notice." But within hours of David's tearful promise to take responsibility for their situation, Sarah called me back with a very different message. This time, her voice was cold and calculating. "I've been talking to some people," she said, "and they tell me that what you're doing could be considered elder financial abuse in reverse. You've been inserting yourself into our financial lives without being asked, creating dependence, and now you're using that dependence to manipulate and control us." I was amazed by her audacity. Sarah, you're the one who called me a senile ATM machine. You're the one who's been spending my money for 3 years without ever saying thank you. And now you're threatening me? I'm not threatening anyone, she replied smoothly. I'm just pointing out that your behavior could be seen as psychologically abusive, creating artificial dependence and then withdrawing support to punish people. That's textbook manipulation. She paused, letting that sink in. But I'm willing to forget all about this if you restore our account access and we can go back to the way things were. David doesn't need to know about this conversation. The sheer brazenness of her attempt to manipulate me was almost impressive. Here was a woman who'd been living entirely off my money while calling me pathetic, now trying to convince me that I was the abusive one for cutting off my own financial support. Sarah, I said, let me be very clear about something. Every penny you've been spending belongs to me. The account you've been using is my account. The house you're living in is secured by my credit and my co-signature. I don't owe you anything, and I'm not manipulating anyone by choosing how to spend my own money. Her facade finally cracked. Fine, she snarled, but don't think this is over. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are. Your neighbors, your friends, everyone at your church. I'm going to tell them how you abandoned your only son and his wife over a petty argument. How you chose your pride over your family. Go ahead, I told her. Tell them that a woman who never worked, never contributed, and never showed an ounce of gratitude finally had to face the consequences of her own choices. I think you'll find that most people understand the difference between generosity and enablement. But Sarah wasn't finished. You know what, Robert? I'm glad this happened. I'm glad I don't have to pretend to care about some lonely old man anymore. I'm glad I don't have to smile and nod while you bore me with stories about your dead wife and your precious construction business. David and I will be fine without you. And you'll be exactly what you deserve to be, alone. Her words stung, but they also clarified something important for me. This was who Sarah really was, who she'd always been underneath the polite facade. David deserved to see this side of his wife, deserved to understand what kind of person he'd married and what kind of future awaited him if he stayed with someone who could speak to his father with such cruelty. Sarah, I said quietly, I want you to remember this conversation in 6 months when you're working retail and David is doing manual labor to pay rent on a studio apartment. I want you to remember that you chose pride over family, not me. 6 months have passed since that awful dinner conversation, and I want you to know that I sleep peacefully now for the first time in years. The foreclosure process on David and Sarah's house took about 3 months, just as Margaret predicted it would. They tried to fight it, tried to claim that I'd somehow defrauded them, but every document was in order and every transaction was legal. When you co-sign a mortgage and make all the payments, you have every right to call in that loan when the other parties can't meet their obligations. Sarah hired a lawyer, spending money they didn't have on legal fees, but Margaret made quick work of their claims. The house sold at auction, and after the mortgage was satisfied, there was actually a small amount left over that went to David and Sarah, though not nearly enough to maintain their previous lifestyle. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town they'd never have considered during their days of living off my generosity. Sarah's threats about ruining my reputation never materialized, probably because she realized that most people would side with the man who'd been taken advantage of rather than the woman who'd been taking advantage of him. David did eventually find a job, not in his preferred field, but honest work at a local manufacturing company that paid enough to cover their basic expenses if they budged carefully. More importantly, he started coming to visit me regularly, but now he comes alone. We've had several long conversations about what happened, about how he let Sarah manipulate both of us, and about what it means to be a man who takes responsibility for his own life. He's apologized more times than I can count, and while it will take time to rebuild the trust between us, I can see that he's genuinely trying to become the person I raised him to be. Sarah, on the other hand, has made it clear that she blames me entirely for their situation. According to David, she spends most of her time complaining about how unfair life is and looking for ways to get back to the lifestyle she feels she deserves. She has gotten a job finally, working retail at a department store, but David tells me she treats it as temporary and still talks about finding someone else to support her ambitions. I feel sorry for my son having to live with that kind of bitterness every day, but those are consequences of choices he made, and he's going to have to decide for himself what kind of future he wants. As for me, I've learned something valuable about the difference between love and enablement, between generosity and being taken advantage of. I've started volunteering at a local charity that helps seniors avoid financial scams, sharing my story as a warning about how family members can sometimes be the ones doing the scamming. I've also begun dating again, something I never thought I'd do at my age, but I met a lovely woman named Helen at church who appreciates the simple pleasure of honest conversation and mutual respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses and force them to grow up. I wish I'd learned that lesson 3 years ago, but I'm grateful I learned it at all. My money is mine to spend as I choose, my respect is mine to give or withhold as I see fit, and my remaining years are too precious to waste on people who see me as nothing more than a convenient resource. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.